The body of a little Australian girl is found dumped in the backblocks of America. Her dad has some suspicious holes in his memory. Her stepmother has been locked up, but so far hasn't been charged with murder.
She was gone, but no one called it in for days. A 10-year-old girl. No school. No sightings. No urgency. Her prosthetic leg was missing. Her room felt abandoned. And the people inside that house couldn't keep their story straight. One version turned into another, then another. And the more they talked, the less anything made sense. Because this wasn't a sudden disappearance. Something had already happened. Something no one wanted to say out loud. This is the story of Zahra Clare Baker. Before we continue, thousands of people watch these documentaries without subscribing. If you don't subscribe right now, YouTube's algorithm may never show you our content again. You won't see updates on cases like Zahra Clare Baker or tomorrow's investigation. We release new cases consistently, but we can only reach you if you're subscribed. Please take a second, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment your location below. It helps more than you think. Zahra deserves her story told. Help keep her story alive. Zahra Clare Baker was 10 years old. She wasn't loud. She wasn't the kind of child who demanded attention. She was quiet in a way that made people underestimate how much she was going through. Born in Australia, Zahra's early life was shaped by something no child should ever have to face. At a young age, she was diagnosed with bone cancer. The treatment was aggressive, relentless, and eventually, doctors made a decision that would change her life forever. Her left leg was amputated above the knee. Most children would struggle to adapt to something like that. But Zahra adapted. She learned to walk again using a prosthetic. She learned to balance, to move, to live with something permanent. And through all of it, the one thing people remembered about her was her attitude. She didn't complain much. She didn't act out. She just tried to keep going. There's something important to understand about Zahra at this point. She was already vulnerable, physically, emotionally, and like many children in her position, she depended heavily on the adults around her. Her father, Adam Baker, was part of that support system. At some point, he remarried. His new wife, Elisa Baker, became Zahra's stepmother. And that's where things begin to shift. Because while Zahra was learning to adapt to a new life after cancer, she was also stepping into a new family dynamic. A dynamic that, from the outside, looked normal, but inside was anything but. Eventually, the family made a major move. They relocated from Australia to the United States, specifically to Hickory, a quiet place, a place where nothing unusual was expected to happen. But what no one around them knew was that Zahra's life inside that home was already becoming more complicated than it appeared. And in cases like this, the warning signs are often there, just not always seen. October 2010. Nothing about the outside world suggested anything unusual. The neighborhood looked the same. People went to work. Children went to school. Life moved normally. But inside Zahra's world, something had already started to break. At first, it wasn't obvious. There was no immediate alarm, no frantic calls, no sudden police presence, just silence. Zahra stopped being seen. She didn't show up to school. No neighbors spotted her outside. And for a child, that kind of absence doesn't usually go unnoticed. But in this case, it did. Days passed. Think about that for a moment. Days. No confirmed sightings. No one stepping forward immediately to raise concern. That delay would later become one of the most troubling parts of this case. Because when a child disappears, time matters. Every hour matters. And here, those hours were already gone. When Zahra was finally reported missing, the timeline was unclear. When was she last seen? Who saw her last? Even the people closest to her couldn't give consistent answers. That's when the first cracks began to show. Because in most missing child cases, the early timeline is critical. And here, the timeline didn't exist in a reliable way. It kept shifting. One version would be given, then corrected, then changed again. And the more investigators listened, the more it felt like they weren't hearing the truth. When authorities entered the home, they expected to find something that pointed them in the right direction. A sign of struggle, a clue, anything. But what they found instead was absence. Zahra's space didn't feel like it had been lived in recently. It didn't feel like a child had just disappeared suddenly. It felt disconnected, like something had already happened before anyone officially acknowledged it. Then came a detail that changed everything. Her prosthetic leg was missing. Now, this is important. A prosthetic limb isn't something a child simply leaves behind. It's essential. Without it, movement becomes difficult, painful. So the question becomes obvious. Why would it be gone? Was it taken? Hidden? Or was it removed as part of something far more serious? That single detail shifted the tone of the entire investigation. Because now, this wasn't just a missing child case anymore. It was something deeper, something darker. At the center of everything were two people, Adam Baker and Elisa Baker, the last known adults responsible for Zahra's care. From the beginning, something stood out. Their accounts didn't align. Not completely. Small details were off. Timelines didn't match. And those inconsistencies kept building. Elisa Baker, in particular, gave statements that raised concern. One moment, a version of events would be presented. Later, it would change. Then shift again. It wasn't just memory gaps. It felt like something else. Something controlled. Something being adjusted depending on the situation. At one point, there was mention of a fire incident. A claim that Zahra may have been involved in something that led to injury. But when investigators looked into it, there was no solid evidence supporting that version. No clear confirmation. Just another layer of confusion. And with every new statement, trust began to erode. Because when the truth is consistent, it doesn't need to be rewritten. Search efforts began the way they always do. Wide. Urgent. Teams moved through wooded areas. Volunteers walked through fields. Dogs were brought in to track scent. Helicopters scanned from above. The community responded quickly. People who had never met Zahra still showed up. Because when a child is missing, people want to help. They want to believe there's still time, still hope. But as the search continued, something started to shift. Quietly at first, then more clearly. Investigators began focusing less on where Zahra might be, and more on what had already happened, because the evidence, or lack of it, wasn't pointing outward. It was pointing inward, back to the house, back to the people inside it. There's a moment in cases like this, a moment when everything changes, not publicly, not announced, but internally. For investigators, it's the moment they stop asking, "Where is she?" and start asking, "What happened to her?" That moment had arrived, because nothing about Zahra's disappearance followed a normal pattern. The delay in reporting, the missing prosthetic, the inconsistent stories, all of it pointed in one direction. And that direction was uncomfortable, because it meant the truth might not be out there in the woods. It might already be inside the story being told, hidden, fragmented, waiting to be uncovered. So here's the question. If Zahra didn't just disappear, then what really happened inside that house? And more importantly, how long had something been wrong before anyone noticed? Comment below. Do you think investigators already knew the truth at this point, or were they still trying to piece it together? By the time investigators fully stepped in, something already felt off. This wasn't a case where they were chasing a clear lead. It wasn't a situation where witnesses were pointing in one direction. Instead, it felt like they were walking into a story that had already been rewritten multiple times. From the outside, it was a missing child case. But inside the investigation, it was becoming something else entirely. Detectives started with the basics. Timeline. Last known sighting. People involved. And immediately, there was a problem. No one could confidently say the last time Zahra had been seen alive. Not neighbors. Not school officials. Not even the people inside the home. That alone changed everything. Because when a timeline is unclear, it creates space. Space for doubt. space for manipulation. And in this case, that space was already filled with contradictions. Elisa Baker quickly became the center of attention, not because she was immediately accused, but because her statements didn't stay consistent long enough to build a clear picture. One version of events would be given, then revised, then replaced. At first, it seemed like confusion, but over time, it began to feel like control, because the details weren't just forgotten. They were being changed. And when investigators hear changing stories in a case involving a missing child, they don't ignore it. They follow it. As the investigation deepened, the search expanded beyond the home. Officers moved into surrounding areas. Woods, brush, open land, places where evidence could be hidden. At first, nothing definitive appeared. But then something changed. Items began to surface. Not large discoveries, not obvious answers, but small pieces, fragments, pieces that didn't belong where they were found. Each one raised a new question. How did this get here? Who put it here? And more importantly, why? Search teams worked carefully, documenting everything. Because in cases like this, even the smallest detail matters. A misplaced object, a disturbed patch of ground. These are the kinds of things that turn suspicion into direction. And slowly, direction was forming. Back inside the investigation, the inconsistencies continued. Elisa Baker provided more statements. But instead of clarifying things, they complicated them. At one point, she suggested Zahra had been injured. Another time, she referenced an incident involving fire. But none of it lined up cleanly. There were gaps, missing connections. And the more investigators compared her statements to physical evidence, the more the differences stood out. It wasn't just that the story was incomplete. It felt like it was being adjusted in real time. And that's when suspicion started to harden. Because there's a difference between not remembering and not telling the truth. Meanwhile, Adam Baker presented himself differently. He appeared cooperative, emotional, but even then, something about the situation didn't settle. Because two people in the same house should share a similar version of events. And here, they didn't. Not completely. Not convincingly. At some point, the investigation crossed a line. Not publicly, but internally. The focus shifted. This was no longer about finding Zahra alive. It became about understanding what had already happened. And once that shift happens, everything changes. Search patterns change. Questions change. And most importantly, the level of urgency changes. Because now, investigators are no longer racing against time. They're trying to reconstruct it. The community began to feel that shift too. Media coverage intensified. People started asking harder questions. Why was there a delay in reporting? Why were the stories inconsistent? What wasn't being said? The case stopped being just a disappearance. It became something people couldn't look away from. The investigation wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. And it definitely wasn't straightforward. There were problems. Serious ones. The timeline was broken. The evidence was incomplete. And the statements being given didn't provide clarity. Instead, they created more confusion. There was no single clear narrative. No obvious sequence of events. And that made everything harder. Because without a clear timeline, proving anything becomes more difficult. Investigators had to work backwards, piece by piece, moment by moment, trying to reconstruct something that no one was clearly describing. And while they were doing that, public pressure was growing. People wanted answers. They wanted accountability. But the case wasn't ready for that yet. Because investigators were still trying to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. Then came a turning point. Something that changed the tone of the investigation completely. Human remains were discovered. Not in one place. Not all at once. But in separate locations. Scattered. Each discovery confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect. Zahra was no longer a missing child. She was a victim. And now, the investigation had to answer a different question. Not where is she, but who did this to her? And how? Once remains were confirmed, everything accelerated. Interviews became more intense. Questions became more direct. There was no longer room for vague answers. Investigators needed specifics. They needed truth. And they needed it quickly. Because the longer a case like this stays unclear, the harder it becomes to fully resolve. Attention turned sharply toward Elisa Baker. Her previous statements were revisited, compared, analyzed, and the inconsistencies became even more obvious. At this point, it wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was focus. Eventually, action was taken. Elisa Baker was arrested. But here's where things get complicated. She wasn't immediately charged with murder. Instead, the charges focused on obstruction, misleading investigators, providing false information. That alone tells you something important. Investigators believed she knew more than she was saying, but they didn't yet have everything they needed to prove the full story. And in cases like this, that matters. Because without solid, complete evidence, the biggest charges can fall apart in court. So they moved carefully, strategically, building the case step by step. Even with an arrest, the case wasn't complete. Far from it. There were still unanswered questions. What exactly happened inside that house? When did it happen? Who was involved? And perhaps the most troubling question of all, how long had Zahra been suffering before this moment? Because the evidence suggested something deeper, something that didn't begin suddenly, something that may have been happening long before anyone started asking questions. And that realization made the case even more disturbing. So now the situation is clear, but not complete. A child is gone. Remains have been found. And the person closest to her is in custody. But the full truth is still missing. Time passes, but the questions don't. Time moves forward. It always does. But in cases like this, it doesn't bring relief. It brings questions. More of them. Because even after the discovery of remains, even after an arrest, the story still wasn't complete. There was no clear beginning, no confirmed sequence of events, just fragments. And those fragments painted a picture that was hard to look at. A picture that suggested this didn't start suddenly. That whatever happened to Zahra may have been building over time, quietly, privately, behind doors no one else could see through. The community felt it. The shift from hope to grief. At first, people searched believing Zahra might be found alive. Now they gathered in silence. Vigils replaced search parties. Candles replaced flashlights. And the question everyone kept asking was the same. How did no one know? Investigators had a difficult task ahead of them. Not just proving what happened, but understanding it. Because without a clear narrative, justice becomes complicated. They began looking deeper into Zahra's life. Her routines, her relationships, her environment. And slowly, patterns began to appear. There were indications of neglect, signs that things inside the home may not have been stable, accounts that suggested Zahra's situation wasn't as normal as it appeared from the outside. But here's the challenge. Much of this information came after the fact, after everything had already gone wrong, which raises a difficult reality. Sometimes the signs are there, but they're missed, or ignored, or simply never reported. And when that happens, the truth only comes out when it's already too late. There's something else investigators had to confront. Silence. Not just the absence of information, but the presence of it. Because silence in a case like this isn't neutral. It often means something was happening, without anyone stepping in. Zahra depended on the people around her. For care, for protection, for support. And yet, somewhere along the line, that support failed. We may never know every moment, every detail, but what became increasingly clear was this. Zahra didn't just disappear one day. There was a lead-up, a progression, and that progression likely included things no child should ever experience. As investigators continued working, something began to shift. The scattered pieces of evidence, the inconsistent statements, the physical findings, they started aligning. Not perfectly, but enough to form direction. Focus narrowed further onto Elisa Baker. Her previous statements were revisited again, each version compared against evidence, each inconsistency highlighted. And over time, the space for alternative explanations started to shrink. Because when multiple versions of a story exist, and only one matches the evidence, the truth begins to surface, even if it's incomplete. Eventually, the case reached a critical point, not in the form of a dramatic trial, not through a long courtroom battle, but through a decision, a plea deal. Elisa Baker agreed to plead guilty, second-degree murder, alongside other related charges. And that moment changed everything. Because a plea deal does two things at once. It delivers a form of justice, but it also limits the story. There would be no full trial, no complete public breakdown of events, no detailed reconstruction presented in court, which means something important. Some parts of what happened may never be fully known. The plea confirmed one thing clearly. Zahra's death was not an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a crime. But beyond that, details remain limited. There is no single, publicly confirmed timeline explaining every moment. No complete narrative describing exactly how events unfolded inside that house. And that absence creates something difficult. Uncertainty. Because humans naturally want closure. They want to understand. They want to connect the beginning to the end. But in this case, some of those connections are missing, and they may stay that way. For the community, the outcome didn't feel complete. Yes, there was a conviction. Yes, someone was held responsible. But something still felt unresolved. Because the full story wasn't told. And when a story ends without full clarity, it lingers. People kept asking questions. What really happened? Could it have been prevented? And perhaps the most painful question of all, did Zahra have anyone who truly saw what she was going through? The case moves toward closure. Or does it? Legally, the case was moving toward resolution. But emotionally, it wasn't there yet. Because closure doesn't just come from a conviction. It comes from understanding. And in this case, understanding was incomplete. There was enough to know something terrible happened, but not enough to fully explain it. And that gap is what makes this case stay with people long after the headlines fade. So now we're left with a difficult reality. A conviction has been made, but the full truth may never be told. And that raises one final question before everything is laid out. Is partial justice still justice? Comment below. Do you think plea deals protect the system or prevent the full truth from ever being known? By the time the case reached its final stage, the direction was clear, but the full story was not. There was no dramatic last-minute discovery, no sudden confession that explained everything step by step. Instead, the case was built slowly, through fragments, through contradictions, through what could be proven and what could not. Investigators had gathered enough evidence to establish one thing beyond doubt. Zahra Clare Baker did not die by accident. Her death was the result of criminal actions inside the home where she was supposed to be safe. And at the center of that conclusion was Elisa Baker. The evidence against her was not based on a single moment. It was built from patterns, inconsistent statements, physical findings, actions taken after Zahra was no longer alive. Together, those pieces formed a case strong enough to move forward, but not strong enough to tell the entire story in court. Elisa Baker ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. So here's what I want to know from you. 1. Do you believe the sentence given to Elisa Baker was true justice for Zahra? 2. Should plea deals be allowed in cases involving the death of a child, even if it means losing full details? 3. Do you think more could have been done earlier to protect Zahra, or were the signs too hidden? 4. Is it more disturbing to know every detail of a crime, or to never know the full truth at all? 5. In situations like this, who carries the greatest responsibility beyond the person convicted? Drop your answers in the comments. I'm reading every single one. A 10-year-old girl who survived cancer, who learned to walk again, who depended on the people around her, and still wasn't protected. That's what stays with you in this case. Not just what happened, but what didn't happen. The intervention that never came. The questions that were never asked in time. Zahra Clare Baker's story is not just about a crime. It's about a system of moments where something could have changed, but didn't. If you care about stories like this being told, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We share cases that matter, cases that raise questions, cases that shouldn't be forgotten. Comment your location below and tell me what you think about the questions we asked. I'll see you in the next case.